Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive, where we cut through the informational clutter and get straight to the essential nuggets of knowledge hiding within the source material you've provided.
And today, we are really opening up something fascinating. We've got a whole stack of research here on a single but incredibly significant Hebrew word, rû.
That's R-U-A-C-H, written as quay. And our mission this time, well, it's pretty ambitious. We're not just going to define this word.
Yeah, not at all.
We're going to track its incredible conceptual journey. I mean, a journey that goes from a physical breeze all the way to the very power of God himself. We want to see how it shifted, across the Old Testament, especially with the prophets.
Right. And for you, the learner, the first thing to really get your head around is that rû isn't a single static idea. You can't just plug in one English word and call it a day.
Not a chance.
It's more like a dynamic spectrum, a continuum of invisible kinetic force.
Wow.
And understanding it is so critical because it touches everything: creation, human life, our emotional character, and how God interacts with the world.
I think we need a working picture right from the start, just to handle how broad this term is. Let's think of rû as something like electrical energy.
That's a great analogy.
It's defined almost entirely by what it does, by its ability to create movement and activity, even when you can't see the energy itself.
Exactly. So sometimes that energy is external, it's wild, it's powerful, like a bolt of lightning or a destructive storm. That's the rû we see in the early biblical stories.
And other times, it's more like a quiet, constant current that just keeps the whole system running. That's the breath of life inside us, the basic force that animates the body.
And then you have its most refined state, where it's like processing power. It becomes the seat of the human mind, of our intellect, of our moral character. It's all the same invisible force, just showing up in different ways depending on the context. And we're going to track that step by step, from the physical to the spiritual.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, the linguistics. Our sources are pretty clear that the root for root is, well, it's ancient and shared across the whole West Semitic language family.
It really is. It's universal in that family. You find these direct cognates, these parallel words, all over the place. In Aramaic, in Arabic, with re, even Ugaritic ro. It tells you the core idea, this moving, invisible force, was a shared concept long before the Bible was even written down.
But the picture gets a little more interesting when you step outside that immediate family of languages, because it's not everywhere.
Right. You look at Akkadian, which is East Semitic, and the root is just gone. It's completely absent.
So what do they use instead?
They use a totally different word, shurum. But what's so fascinating is that shurum carries the exact same conceptual weight as rûk. It means wind, and it means breath. So the words are different, but the idea of linking the atmosphere to the life force is the same all across the ancient Near East.
That's a key point. So the underlying theology or worldview is consistent. You see that in phrases like the Akkadian shāru balea, the breath of my life.
It functions exactly like how Hebrew talks about the king being the breath of our nostrils. The mechanism of life is tied to moving air, no matter which word you use for it.
And the sources also point out that the word rû itself is probably onomatopoeic.
Yeah, which I love. It wasn't just some abstract label they came up with. The sound of it. It sort of mimics the whistling of wind, or maybe the sound of heavy, excited breathing. The word sounds like the force it's describing.
That's fantastic. Now, just a quick technical note on the grammar, because I think it shows how flexible this term is. It's usually a feminine noun in Hebrew.
Overwhelmingly feminine, yes.
But when it's talking about meteorological wind, like a storm, it often switches to masculine.
It does. When the wind is an active, powerful agent, it tends to become masculine. Like in Exodus 10, the rû that brings the plague of locusts, that's masculine. Or in 1 Kings 19, that incredible mountain-splitting wind that Elijah witnesses.
I wonder if that's a subtle signal. When it's just a passive breeze, it stays feminine. But when it becomes this active, destructive force, it takes on a masculine grammatical gender to signal that agency.
That's a very plausible way to read it, though there's no hard and fast rule from scholars. What we can say for sure is that in its most basic physical sense, rû means wind over 100 times in the Old Testament.
And the range is just huge. It can be the softest evening breeze, the rû hayom in the Garden of Eden that God walks in.
The cool of the day.
Right. All the way to a devastating storm or gale that can part the sea in Exodus or destroy Job's house.
And that physical wind was also just incredibly practical for daily life, specifically for knowing which way was which. Their whole system of geography was based on the movement of air.
It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? They use the four winds, arborudo, which mirrors the Akkadian idea of the four winds. It's how they oriented their world.
And their directions were so pragmatic. For instance, the word for west was often rûaḥ, which literally means sea wind.
Because the Mediterranean Sea was to their west.
Exactly. When Ezekiel is measuring the temple complex in chapter 42, the text calls the west side the rûaḥ side. Their understanding of meteorology was literally built into their architecture.
Okay, now let's pivot to the first big metaphor that comes out of this idea of wind. Futility. Because wind is invisible, you can't grab it, you can't control it. It becomes this perfect symbol for nothingness or emptiness.
And this is the great theme of the book of Ecclesiastes, isn't it? The whole book is wrestling with the apparent meaninglessness of human effort under the sun.
And the key phrase, the one that just sums up all that frustration, is rûaḥ.
Often translated striving after wind.
Yeah, or chasing the wind. I've even seen shepherding the wind, which really captures the absurdity of it. It's like trying to herd something that can't be herded.
It's the perfect metaphor for any effort that has no substance. You invest all this labor, all this energy, and at the end of the day, you have nothing to show for it because you are pursuing something that by its very nature can't be caught.
And the preacher in Ecclesiastes puts rûaḥ right next to the word habel, which means vapor or smoke. If habel is like smoke, you see it for a second and then it's gone. Rûaḥ is even more elusive. You can't even see the wind.
That's a great point. It makes rûaḥ an even more powerful way to talk about the absolute limits of human effort when it's not connected to God's purpose.
So from the physical world outside, we move to the world inside the body, breath. And here we need to draw a careful distinction, at least initially, between rûaḥ and another word, nešāmâ.
Yes, this is crucial because later on they start to overlap, but in the beginning they were different. Nešāmâ is your normal, quiet breathing, the gentle in and out that just keeps you alive.
It's life on autopilot.
Right. Whereas rûaḥ in this context originally meant dynamic breathing. We're talking about gasping, snorting in anger, panting from exertion. It's the forceful movement of air that shows a creature is animated, emotional, and full of vitality.
You can even see this applied to God, right? The rûaḥ, the blast from God's nostrils. It's a sign of his active, powerful, and often angry intervention.
Yes, that connection between heavy breathing and intense emotion is immediate. It links the external wind to our internal state.
And this distinction helps us understand Genesis. God breathes the nešāmâ, the standard breath of life, into Adam. But the broader concept of divine animation is often tied to rûaḥ.
And as you said, eventually those two terms started to merge. By the post-exilic period, rûaḥ had basically absorbed the meaning of nešāmâ. It just became the general term for the God-given life principle in all creatures, the thing that leaves the body at death.
You see that so clearly in Psalm 104, which is a key text for the Reformed view of God's sovereignty over life. When God takes away the rûaḥ, the creatures perish. The life force goes back to the one who gave it.
It stabilizes the concept. Whether you call it quiet breath or dynamic force, it's the animating principle, and it comes from God.
Okay, so let's follow that movement inward.
Yeah.
As rûaḥ goes from being external wind to internal breath, it's a logical next step for it to become the spirit of a person, the invisible core of emotion and character.
Precisely. It's no longer describing the atmospheric pressure outside. It's describing your internal pressure, your temperament.
Hebrew is just full of these idioms, isn't it? Like quatsaruk, shortness of spirit.
Which means impatience, a short temper. Proverbs warns against it. Your spirit is short, so you react quickly, rashly.
And the opposite is erek rûaḥ, length of spirit, which means patience, forbearance. It's like having a long fuse. The internal state of your rûaḥ determines your reaction time.
And that internal state then dictates your external actions. In a military context, rûaḥ is courage, it's vigor. When the people of Jericho heard about what God had done for Israel, Joshua says their rûaḥ melted.
They lost their will to fight. Their inner vitality was just gone.
Their capacity to act was directly tied to the condition of their spirit.
This is probably a good place to pause and clarify how rûaḥ relates to a couple of other key Hebrew terms for human nature, because in English they can all sound the same. I'm thinking of nephesh and leb.
Yes, let's do that. The sailboat analogy is really helpful here.
Okay, walk us through it.
So think of the boat. The physical hull, the wood and nails, the part that's tangible and, frankly, weak. That is basar, the flesh. It's frail and corruptible. Isaiah 31 makes that exact contrast. Don't trust in the Bezar of Egypt's armies. Trust in God's rû.
Okay, so Besar is the hull. What about the rudder? The thing that steers the boat?
That's the leb, or libab, the heart. And in the ancient world, you have to remember, the heart wasn't the seat of emotion. It was the seat of intellect and will. It was the cognitive center where you made decisions and plans.
So it's the command center.
It is. Now, rûaḥ starts to take on that function much later, especially in Ezekiel, where a new spirit is linked to a new heart. We'll get to that.
And finally, the whole boat itself. The living, moving vessel.
That is nefesh. It's often translated soul, but it really just means the person as a whole, the living being. And here's the key distinction. Nefesh is the person. Rûaḥ is the wind in the sails. It's the invisible force, the temper, the energy that drives the vessel.
I think that's such an important point. Rûaḥ is often seen as something external that comes upon a person, while nefesh is the person's own identity.
Exactly. And that keeps the door open for the divine rûaḥ to influence the human rûaḥ. It's why the psalmist can pray for God to renew a steadfast spirit within him. The spirit, the seat of his will, is something that God can grant and regulate.
And that brings us right back to Ezekiel, who just masterfully bridges this anthropological idea with the divine solution for Israel's disobedience.
He really does. He presents this anthropological renewal as a divine gift. It's a stunning theological move. He introduces the idea of the new spirit, rûaḥ.
And he pairs it directly with a new heart. God will take out the heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh and a new spirit.
And for anyone listening with a background in Reformed theology, your ears should be perking up right now. This is the Old Testament root of the doctrine of regeneration. It's the divine answer to the problem articulated in the Westminster Confession, that fallen man is unable to will his own conversion.
Right. God has to do the work. He grants not only the ability, but the will to obey his laws. He replaces the self-willed human rûaḥ with a new one that is aligned with him.
It makes the rûaḥ the very mechanism of our moral capacity.
Now let's follow this term as it moves out of the Hebrew world and into the Greek, specifically into the Septuagint translation, because this step had massive consequences for how people understood the concept later on.
A huge step. So the translators are faced with this word, rûaḥ, all 378 times it appears, with this massive range of meanings. And they have to pick a Greek word. The word they overwhelmingly chose was poema, pneuma.
The sources say it's used 277 times. They were clearly leaning into the spiritual dynamic force idea rather than just the physical wind.
Right. For the physical wind, they use another word, animos, about 52 times. But the preference for pneuma shows that by that time, the spiritual sense of rûaḥ was really seen as its primary meaning.
But choosing pneuma wasn't a neutral act, was it? That word already had a history in the Greek world. It was loaded with philosophical ideas.
It absolutely was. So when a later reader, a Christian reader, encounters the Holy Spirit, pim igarn, in the New Testament, they're reading a term that has already been filtered through Greek philosophy about spirit, mind, and non-material reality.
So the act of translation itself starts to shape the theology.
It inevitably does. It's not that it was a bad translation. Pneuma is etymologically very close, but it read the Hebrew concept into a new intellectual environment. And that environment, well, it added new layers of meaning.
It creates this sort of interpretive loop then.
Yeah.
To really understand the New Testament's pneuma, you have to circle back to the Hebrew rûaḥ to grasp that original idea of a forceful, active power, not just an abstract Greek philosophical concept.
That's the work of good hermeneutics, yes.
Okay, so now we get to the theological heart of it, the rûaḥ, the Spirit of Yahweh. And the history here is just full of dramatic shifts. It goes from these sudden explosive bursts of power to becoming a term that the true prophets actually avoided.
It's a wild ride. In the earliest layers of the text, like in Judges and 1 Samuel, the rûaḥ is just pure, raw, dynamic, eruptive force. It's not a gentle, indwelling presence, it's an intrusion. It falls on or clothes someone for a specific and often violent purpose.
Samson is the poster child for this, isn't he?
The classic example. The Spirit of Yahweh comes mightily upon him, and suddenly he has this temporary superhuman strength to kill a lion or snap his bonds. It was a divine power-up for a military task. It had nothing to do with making him a good person or giving him a permanent job.
And it was often tied to ecstatic states, to prophecy that looked very different from what we see later.
Yes, the rûaḥ would fall on these bands of prophets and induce trances. It was seen as this contagious psychic power. It even falls on King Saul when he's not expecting it and he starts prophesying. It was defined purely by the dramatic effects it produced.
And we have to be honest here. Those effects were not always good or heroic. This is a point that really challenges our modern New Testament ideas about the Spirit.
It does. The texts force us to look at the dark side. God can send a malignant spirit, a rûaḥ, that torments King Saul. This spirit is the source of his depression, his madness, his paranoia.
How does that work? How can a divine spirit, a force from God, be evil? That seems like a contradiction.
And that's the vital question. The answer is that in this early worldview, the rûaḥ is judged by its function, not its intrinsic moral quality. It's an instrument of God's sovereign will. If God's purpose is to bring judgment or psychological turmoil on someone, he uses a rûaḥ to do it. The spirit is defined by the effect it causes.
So it's the mechanism of divine action, whether that action is salvation or judgment.
Exactly, which brings us to this really strange period, the prophetic silence. If this spirit was so central, why does the word rûaḥ almost disappear from the writings of the great pre-exilic prophets? You look at Jeremiah, only 18 mentions, Hosea just 7, Micah, a mere 3.
It seems like they should be talking about it all the time.
You'd think so. But this was a deliberate choice. It was a polemic. The true writing prophets avoided the term because it had become tainted. It was the favorite word of the false prophets, the ecstatic nebiim, who would claim, I have the rûaḥ, to legitimize their false messages of peace and security.
So the very language had been compromised.
It had. The classic showdown is in 1 Kings 22. You have the prophet Micaiah facing off against 400 court prophets who are all telling King Ahab to go to war, claiming the spirit is with them.
But Micaiah reveals they're all operating under a lying spirit, a rûaḥ sent by God to deceive them.
Exactly. So because a simple claim to have the rûaḥ was no longer a reliable test of a true prophet, the real prophets they set the term aside. They grounded their authority in something else.
The word of Yahweh.
The word of Yahweh. A much more stable, verifiable source of authority tied to God's covenant and his actions in history, not to a subjective, ecstatic experience.
So, to use an analogy, it's like the instrument of the Spirit had been used by so many false players that the true musicians decided to stick only to the voice, to the direct word, to avoid any confusion.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was a massive theological sacrifice to maintain doctrinal purity.
And you can see this pattern when you look at which books don't use the word rûaḥ at all.
Right. It's completely absent from Leviticus, Ruth, Song of Songs, Esther, Obadiah, Nahum, and Zephaniah.
The pattern makes sense. It's not in technical legal texts like Leviticus where there's no room for ecstatic unpredictability.
And it's not in books focused on human love stories or political maneuvering like Ruth or Esther. It shows up where you'd expect it. In poetry like the Psalms and Job, and in visionary books where God's direct and visible action is the main event.
Which sets the stage perfectly for its great return. The term rûaḥ comes back from this prophetic exile, but it's completely transformed, and the data here is just amazing. Ezekiel uses rûaḥ more than any other book, 52 times.
With Isaiah right behind him at 51, though most of those are in the later sections of the book. This is a deliberate, massive revitalization of the concept, and Ezekiel is the main architect.
He picks that discredited instrument back up, he retunes it, and he plays it more beautifully and more profoundly than anyone before him.
Yeah, he uses it in several innovative ways. One of the most striking is as a means of visionary transport. The rûaḥ literally lifts him up and carries him in visions from his exile in Babylon back to Jerusalem.
That's functionally so important for the exiles, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Spirit is bridging the physical distance. It's a tangible sign that God hasn't abandoned them, that he's still communicating with them, even though they're far from the temple.
It is. And then he uses rûaḥ for creation and revival. I mean, you can't talk about Ezekiel without talking about the Valley of Dry Bones in chapter 37.
An incredible vision. The dead, dry bones of the nation of Israel.
And God tells him to prophesy to the rûaḥ, to the wind, to the breath. And when the rûaḥ enters the bones, they come to life and stand up, a vast army.
That's such a brilliant theological connection. He's linking national resurrection directly back to creation in Genesis 1, where the rûaḥ of God was hovering over the waters. The same power that creates life from nothing is the power that can bring a dead nation back to life.
And that leads to his most important contribution, especially for our theological tradition, anthropological renewal. We touched on the new spirit, rûaḥ, earlier, but we really need to dig in here.
This is God's final answer to Israel's constant willful sin. He says in chapter 36, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh.
This is a radical reimagining of rû. It's no longer a temporary external force for fighting, like with Samson. It is now an internal, permanent disposition that produces obedience. The stony, rebellious heart is replaced, and the new rû provides both the will and the ability to follow God's laws.
This is the very heart of the covenant of grace. It's a powerful affirmation that we, in our fallen state, simply do not have the spiritual capacity to obey. God must act first. He has to change our inner disposition before obedience is even possible.
It aligns perfectly with the Westminster Confession's language about effectual calling. God gives us the desire and the ability. Ezekiel places the rû at the center of that subjective experience of salvation and sanctification. It becomes the agent of God's internal government in the believer.
So while Ezekiel is focusing on this internal universal renewal for the whole community, Isaiah takes the concept in a slightly different direction.
Yes, Isaiah also has high usage, but he focuses the rû primarily on one figure, the Messianic king. He gives it a more institutional political role.
Especially in passages like Isaiah 11 and 42. Here, the Spirit of Yahweh isn't a temporary surge of power. It's a static, permanent gift that rests on the Messiah.
And notice what that gift is for. It's not for superhuman strength. The Spirit equips him with wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and the fear of Yahweh.
It's a leadership toolkit.
It's the perfect endowment for a righteous king and judge. It's a constant anointing that makes him capable of ruling justly.
So you have this fascinating contrast during the exile. Ezekiel is using rû to talk about the internal anthropological change needed for every single person in the covenant,
while Isaiah uses it to talk about the permanent institutional empowerment for the unique office of the Messiah. One's for the people, the other's for the king. Both are reclaiming the term for God's redemptive plan.
And we should just note that even in Isaiah, that older polemic is still there, contrasting God's rû with human weakness.
Oh, absolutely. In Isaiah 30 and 31, he scoffs at the idea of trusting in Egypt's armies, calling them mere flesh, basar. Trusting in human alliances is like trusting in the wind. Trusting in Yahweh means trusting the spirit that controls the wind.
So we've tracked rû through its entire life cycle in the Old Testament, from a wild storm to a discredited term to a regenerating force to a messianic endowment. What's the final stage? Where does the concept end up in the post-exilic world?
The final stage is, I think, the logical conclusion of where Ezekiel was heading. It's democratization.
The promise that this exclusive gift will finally be shared with everyone.
Exactly. The late prophetic books, especially Joel chapter 2 in the English Bible, Joel 3 in the Hebrew, promise an outpouring of the Spirit on all flesh. Not just kings or prophets, sons, daughters, old men, young men, even servants.
It takes that ecstatic, visionary experience that was once reserved for a select few and makes it the general condition of the entire covenant community. It just flattens the spiritual hierarchy.
It does. It implies that every member of the renewed people of God will have a direct, intuitive connection to his will. It's the full flowering of Ezekiel's new spirit promise.
And after the exile, you can even see them reinterpreting their own history through this lens, right? They start describing the skills of the tabernacle craftsmen or the leadership of Moses as being the work of the rû.
Yes, that retroactive application really cements the rû as God's all-purpose agent for equipping his people for any task, whether it's art, leadership, or moral renewal. It's no longer a random force. It's central to God's sovereign plan throughout history.
Okay, let's pull it all together with that final analogy. The whole evolution of rû is like the difference between a wild, unpredictable storm and a modern, comprehensive climate control system.
That's a great way to summarize it. The early period, that's the wild storm. It strikes specific people unpredictably with overwhelming force, usually for a short-term military goal. It's an event. It's chaos.
But the later prophetic view, the one shaped by Ezekiel and Isaiah, sees the rû as something totally different. It's that climate control system.
A divine climate control system. It fills the whole house, the whole community of Israel, and its job is to regulate the internal temperature, the heart, the will of everyone inside. And that internal regulation leads, by God's design, to new life and obedience. The term moves completely from external chaos to ordered internal governance.
So the single unifying thread through all of this is that rû is always about dynamic, invisible movement. It's the wind, it's the breath, it's the force that moves the mind and drives God's plan forward.
And the ultimate source is always God. That's the common thread. He creates the physical wind, he gives the breath of life to every living thing, and he is the one who bestows the new spirit of regeneration on his people. It all comes from him.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, as you think about this? We saw how the human spirit, rû, and God's spirit, rûaḥ, are often used almost interchangeably in the Psalms to talk about our emotional state being crushed in spirit or having a steadfast spirit. It shows how our physical life, our mental state, and our spiritual temper are all woven together. So here's a thought to take with you. Since rû governs everything from your mood to the weather, think about your own disposition. The ancient Hebrews believed the state of your spirit was tied directly to the divine source that animates you. Does the inner climate of your heart, the state of your rû, reflect that new, steadfast spirit that God promises to give and to sustain? That connection between the invisible force of God and our own internal state is something worth contemplating this week.